Now, the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson is facing day 2 of his COVID inquiry grilling, where he has said that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme was not seen as a gamble at the time, and that he was perplexed at the suggestion that top scientists were unaware of the scheme.
Meanwhile, he has said he was not reconciled to COVID deaths or thought it wise to let it rip in the autumn of 2020, strongly rejecting the idea that he had backed such a strategy as the government grappled with rising COVID cases in September 2020.
But let's get the juicy bits now with GBNews political correspondent Olivia Utley, who's outside the inquiry for us. And Olivia, there have been some tetchy moments and back and forths. I'm interested particularly about when Hugo Keith KC raised these sort of quotes from Patrick Vallence's diary.
Well, absolutely. That was probably the tetchiest moment, as you put it, from the Prime Minister. Hugo Keith KC raised these extracts from Patrick Vallence's diary, where Patrick Vallence had written that the Prime Minister opened a meeting with a discussion that perhaps the virus should be just allowed to let rip, and that some of the people who were dying of the virus, those in their 80s and 90s, had, and I quote, had a good innings. Now, at that point, Boris Johnson started huffing and puffing, and he said to Hugo Keith that yes, he didn't deny using the phrase "let it rip," but he said that at that point it was his duty to try and challenge the consensus. He said that his feelings weren't reconciled to fatalities across the country, and he did not believe that the virus should be allowed to let rip, but it was his duty to push back against some of the predictions that the scientists were making and to provide some sort of alternative proposition. That was the first moment where it got a little bit tricky for Boris Johnson. There was then an in-depth discussion about that second national lockdown, and most importantly, the timing of that second national lockdown. As we know, if you can cast your minds back this far, around September of 2020, it was clear from the data that the virus was making a bit of a resurgence. But at that moment, Boris Johnson chose not to act, chose not to impose another lockdown. There was, of course, advice being given at the time from head teachers, from those in influential parts of the Treasury, saying that obviously there are problems with imposing a full national lockdown. So in September, Boris Johnson chose not to impose a lockdown. Later on, he imposed those tiers, where different parts of the country were assigned different tiers and were allowed different levels of freedom dependent on how much the virus was circulating in that area. Now, Hugo Keith argued that if that tier system had been brought in earlier, then the second national lockdown in November 2020 could have been avoided. Boris Johnson essentially said that hindsight is great, but at the time his government did the very best that they could with the data.
Olivia, what's your judgment on how Boris Johnson is coming across? Yesterday he did appear quite calm, quite measured. He wasn't there to throw anyone under the bus, so it seemed. How is he doing today? Those tetchy moments, is he perhaps coming across a little more frustrated?
Well, I think that the most important thing to say, perhaps, is that we are seeing a completely different side to Boris Johnson than pretty much anything we've ever seen before. He's usually one for flowery rhetoric, for theatrics. We are seeing none of that today, and we didn't see it yesterday either. We're seeing a sort of sorrowful Boris Johnson, a Boris Johnson with some gravitas. I would say that he is pretty measured, apart from those moments where you could see a little bit of tetchiness shining through. He is pushing forward the case quite compellingly. To me, that the argument that he had to put up, he had to sort of challenge the consensus when scientists were urging for another lockdown, that he had to raise the possibility that it might be sensible to allow a few more older people to die instead of imposing a national lockdown with all of the problems that would entail. The case that he made seemed to be quite compelling. It was a better performance today, I thought, than some of the performances that he gave during lockdown. It seems that hindsight for Boris Johnson too has been beneficial.
And Olivia, just quickly, what do you make of how the COVID inquiry lawyer, Hugo Keith, KC is interacting with Boris Johnson? Does it seem like it's a bit more of a persecution, or does it seem like today he's actually wanting to understand the thoughts of this incredibly difficult balancing act that politicians undertook at that time?
Well, it's very hard to say. It's a really interesting question, Tom, because Hugo Keith is certainly sort of on the attack, and it's hard to work out precisely to what extent that's simply his lawyerly way of speaking, and to what extent it is a sort of, he doesn't like the cut of Boris Johnson's jib, if you like. I would say that today, more than yesterday, it does seem as though Hugo Keith is trying to understand exactly what Boris Johnson's thoughts were at the time, and is trying to sort of get a grip of the wider picture. There have been a couple of times, interestingly, when Boris Johnson has finished off Keith's questions for him, and there has been a lot less talking over each other from the pair of them. I think perhaps there might have been some sort of intervention from Lady Hallett about that. The line of questioning from Hugo Keith is certainly very much more still about the exact timings of when national lockdowns were introduced, and there hasn't been very much discussion about the sort of broader issue of whether repeated national lockdowns were the right strategy, given what we know in hindsight about the effects on some of the poorest children, for example, in society. There was a little interlude which I thought was very interesting, where an extract was read out from Patrick Vallence's diary, where Boris Johnson had said that he wanted to see evidence, clear evidence, of the economic effects of a lockdown, and he wanted to see a proper cost-benefit analysis. And at that point, Hugo Keith said, perhaps one of the lessons that we should learn from this pandemic is that a cost-benefit analysis would be good in the future, which I think will be music to the ears of some GB News viewers.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Olivia Utley, GB News political reporter there outside the COVID inquiry.